Welcome for this beautiful end of September for our Nurture the Soul. I am blessed to be your host today, and I am Reverend Ellie Hutchison, Minister for Congregational and Community Engagement with the Faith Info team. And we are a part of the Love of Church at the national setting of the United Church of Christ. Nurture the Soul is a weekly webinar series that provides our local churches and faith practitioners with a multitude of practical, educational, innovative, and formational resources that seeks to engage with the critical topics of our time, to center the care and education for the people of God. From cultural and community organizing to congregational leadership, from worship and theology to resourcing small and rural churches, from ministry with youth and children to a wide array of justice issues. We feature guest artists, authors, theologians, pastors, and key leaders. Nurture the Soul stays current to how the gospel is alive for each of us in this time. And we hope and pray that this space is a space for connection, to build community, and to have your soul nurtured, because we believe in the collective movement towards the world that God imagines for all of us. We invite you every Thursday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Nurture the Soul, and from time to time, look for special offerings. You can find a full list of our upcoming digital programs at ucc.org/events or on all of our social media platforms. And friends, if these conversations move you, if what's being offered here helps to enhance your ministry, your community organizing, or even nurtures your soul, please consider donating towards the annual fund of the United Church of Christ. And you can do this by texting UCC to the number 41444. It's your prayerful and financial support that helps programs like this continue the essential work of the United Church of Christ. And we thank you for supporting us, but more importantly, thank you for being with us today, whether you're joining us live here at this recording or you're watching us in the future. You're taking time to be with us today. But before I introduce this week's guest, I'd like to remind you to use the chat feature to share where you're zooming in from and to continue the conversations amongst each other. You can find that chat feature along the bottom of your screen, and the icon looks like a dialogue bubble from those old-time cartoons, and it has 3 dots in the center. We also invite you to use the Q&A feature in order to ask our guests questions that might come up for you. Again, you can find this button at the bottom of your screen, and it also looks like a dialogue bubble, but this time it has a question mark in the middle of it, and we'll get to your questions towards the end of today's webinar. Today is part two of a series that I have been blessed to work on with Reverend Mark Pettis, and we are talking about multi-religious or multiple religious belonging. We are witnessing an increase in our culture of our individuals, of our community, and our families who practice and or identify with more than one faith tradition. The questions that we'll be covering today is there room in our congregations to welcome and embrace these people and their families? How does this look different in the settings of the church? And today our panelists are going to speak about this present and growing reality in our churches from a variety of perspectives and discuss how it is part of our sense of expansive welcome. And so with that, I invite our panelists to join us on screen. And Mark, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ellie. It is wonderful to be here with you all today. And I wanted to give a couple words of introduction in terms of the topic. We in the United Church of Christ have a rich history of ecumenical engagement, of interfaith, interreligious engagement. The last statistic I saw from just a couple of years ago indicated that 70% of our congregations in the United Church of Christ report being engaged in ecumenical and or interfaith work in their local settings. But as we look at this idea in the United Church of Christ of the extravagant welcome that we offer, we always have to look at those areas where we have more to learn so that that welcome can truly be extravagant and expansive. And so our General Minister and President, the Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson, has identified some areas, including the area of multiple religious belonging, an area in which she has written, and an area where our congregations, I think, we have congregations where this is a reality for them on a daily basis. And the question is, how does this work? How do we understand this idea? And how can we perhaps lean more intentionally into being spaces where people who identify with multiple faith traditions are welcomed, affirmed, celebrated, and are fully embraced in our congregational settings. And so today we have a couple of folks who are going to be sharing with us their perspectives. We have with us Peniel Jesudasan Rufus, who I'm sure I tore up their pronunciation of your name, Peniel. Um, but Peniel has a background in scholarship around multiple religious belonging. In fact, the book for which our General Minister and President wrote a chapter was edited by Peniel. And so he will be sharing with us perspectives on the idea and what the understanding of multiple religious belonging is. And then we also have with us Annabelle Lala Ramkalawan, who also I'm sure I've destroyed the pronunciation of your name. And um, Annabelle joins us from Trinidad and Tobago. And I had the pleasure of meeting Annabelle at a meeting somewhat recently. And she was describing for me the culture of Trinidad and Tobago as one where the different faith traditions live together. And so the idea of multiple religious belonging is just a daily reality in her region. So we are blessed to have them with us today. And so I'd like to hand it over to Peniel to share with us.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your generous words of welcome. I have very good experiences of collaborating with the UCC in organizing a seminar on multiple religious belonging at the UCC offices with General Minister and President. And I'm really, really grateful for the opportunity to be here in this webinar. So what I'm going to be doing is to give a broad global perspective on multiple religious belonging. It is often said that we live in a world that has gone irreversibly interfaith. So in such a world, as the Asian American theologian Peter Fan felicitously put it, the only way to be religious is probably to be religious interreligiously. And today what I want to be doing is to speak about the challenges of the boundaried understandings of religion that primarily understand religions as reified single entities out there into which people are expected to fit in. One of the paradoxes of our world today is that despite the tacit acknowledgement that hybridity is intrinsic to most of the received and practiced major faiths, there is still an overwhelming insistence on rigidity and singularity of religious identifications and affiliations. This, of course, poses problems to those who, out of necessity, upbringing, or choice, find spiritual and ritual sustenance in other religious traditions along, say, for example, Christianity, and openly acknowledge that they have been faithed by drinking deeply from the wells of different religious and spiritual traditions. So therefore, what I'll seek to do today is, from a perspective which is both existential and at times ethnographic, explore the theological and some of the pastoral questions which emerge at the interstices of what I called blurred religious affiliations and borderless ritual practices. In other words, multiple religious belonging. So today we will take a look at a fascinating phenomenon in our multi-religious world, which is often known using the term multiple religious belonging. According to Catherine Cornell, a scholar who has done pioneering work on this theme, the expression multiple religious belonging refers to various kinds and degrees of belonging to more than one religion. While some people identify predominantly with one tradition and partly with another, others find themselves between traditions, moving back and forth between the normativity of one or the other in various aspects of faith and practice. Some people have also referred to this phenomenon using other terms like dual belonging, multiple religious participation, hybrid or hyphenated identities. However, for the sake of convenience, I will use the word multiple religious belonging in my presentation today. What Catherine Cornell does is identify different forms of multiple religious belonging. She makes a helpful distinction between what she calls involuntary and voluntary forms of multiple religious belonging. Under involuntary forms of belonging, one can list contexts where belonging to more than one religion is a social or cultural given. One can also list being born in interfaith families as an example of this, where the parents might belong to two different religious traditions. Among the former, Cornell lists examples from East Asia, where, for example, being Chinese traditionally meant belonging to Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, or where being Japanese involved participation in both Buddhist and Shinto rituals, in addition to whatever other religion one might adopt. So, under voluntary forms of multiple religious belonging, one can also list temporary or permanent forms of belonging. Temporary forms of belonging or multiple religious participation would be when one undertakes a pilgrimage to the religious place usually associated with another religious tradition for a specific purpose, say for India, popularly to pray for a child or to seek deliverance or healing from sickness, etc. And sometimes it might also involve things like a Hindu going to an open Christian revival meeting or a Christian practicing Zen Buddhist meditation. Permanent belonging, on the other hand, means when one holds two or more religious identities together simultaneously. A few examples of such permanent belongers from the past that stand out could be people like Jules Monchanin, Henry Lissoc, also known as Swami Abhishektananda, who lived in India, and Bede Griffiths, the English Benedictine monk, and Raymond Panika, all of whom tried to live out the Christian life in Hindu and Buddhist contexts in India. In fact, Panika is said to have declared, and I quote, "I left Europe for India as a Christian. I discovered I was a Hindu and returned as a Buddhist without ever having ceased to be a Christian." Reflecting on the experience of these four Roman Catholic theologians, Joseph Prabhu, who was Panika's biographer, in his obituary for Panika wrote as follows. He says, "All four of them, in different ways, discovered and cherished the riches and the deep spiritual wisdom of the Indic traditions and attempted to live out and express their core Christian convictions in Hindu and Buddhist forms. To some extent, this multiple belonging was made possible by their embrace of Advaita, the Indic idea of non-dualism, which sees the deep, often hidden connections between traditions without in any way minimizing the differences between them. From the contemporary context, one can also count the Roman Catholic American theologian Paul Nitter under this category of permanent multiple religious belongers. Nitter is well known for his book, Without Buddha, I Could Not Be a Christian. In one of his interviews, Nitter reflects on what his dual belonging means for him in the following manner. And this is what he writes. At this point, it is difficult for me to imagine being a Christian without the help of Buddhism. My passing over to what Gautama discovered and his followers have passed on through study, through friends, through practice, has not only enriched my Christian identity, rather, Buddhism has also been a source, really another source of revelation, without which I could not have dealt satisfactorily with many key and theological issues. It should not be considered that multiple religious belonging only happens when one combines Christianity with other dharmic religions. It can also happen between the Abrahamic faiths and with several other indigenous religious traditions. In fact, the former Episcopalian priest Anne Holmes Redding claimed to also be a Muslim before she was defrocked by her church. So when we speak of multiple religious belonging, I think one way of understanding multiple religious belonging from a global perspective is to approach it from the perspective of world Christianities, because there is no one size that fits all when it comes to multiple religious belonging. It is often the question of searching for the one size that matters, and therefore paying attention to specificity can be one way in which we can understand the range of belonging that happens through this phenomenon of multiple religious belonging. The manner in which questions about multiple religious belonging are posed to some extent discloses the geographical situatedness and the conceptual presuppositions of the scholars in this question, according to John Tattamanen. So when we look at global perspectives of religion, these perspectives complicate the perspective of multiple religious belonging, because against a dominant perspective of religions that demands religiousness to require exclusiveness, a global perspective helps us to understand that religions are in fact fluid entities which have flown into and out of each other and are not actually discrete, reified, or homogeneous entities. For much of human history, we know societies are simultaneously informed and formed by many traditions. So when we focus attention on this phenomenon of multiple religious belonging, what we are doing is to help highlight the hybrid nature of religions in a context of hostility based on fixed and reified religious identities. So just think, let's pause for a minute and think of the way in which Christianity evolved from Judaism and spread to different parts of the world. There is a constant religious and cultural inflow in the shaping of early Christianity. For example, the early Christian communities, if you look at the Bible, are often described as communities which spent much time together in the temple, which is the Jewish tradition, but at the same time broke bread at home, which is a distinctive practice that they developed as a new community in the book of Acts chapter 2:46. So we also know how many of the Christian festivals, including Easter and Christmas, bear influences from outside the Christian faith. However, despite the tacit acknowledgement that hybridity is intrinsic to most of the received and practiced Christian faith, there is an overwhelming insistence on rigidity and singularity of religious identifications and affiliations. And therefore, the focus on multiple religious belonging helps us to think of the interconnections between religions in a new way. The other thing that multiple religious belonging helps us to do is to focus on issues that cannot be easily articulated. When I worked for the World Council of Churches, we conducted a series of consultations on multiple religious belonging, including one in Cleveland, Ohio. These consultations helped those who were part of it to understand that it is often very difficult to give an account of how multiple religious belonging happens in a person's life. Michael Jageser, a leader from the United Reformed Church in Britain, who is originally from Guyana, in one of her meetings said this. He said, "For those like myself, multiple religious belonging is the story of our lives. Only in retrospect, I am now able to give a content to some of its fascination and mystery. Much is largely unexplainable, and that is fascinating, as the mystery is to be lived into, not explained. Mystery that transforms rather than simply informs. The challenge of framing a concept of fluidity that does not simply slide back into the logic of one is a pressing one." That's an important comment to take note of. It is therefore important for those who are engaged in interreligious dialogue to bear in mind that explaining one's religious experiences, especially when one is faithed multiply, is not always an easy one. Multiple religious belonging also helps us to focus on the religious experiences of the marginalized. Scholars have pointed out that people who are marginalized often make use of religious and spiritual resources in new ways, and that necessity breeds creativity in context of disempowerment. Your own UCC minister, Michelle Vos-Roberts, was also involved in some of this conversation on multiple religious belonging and has written on it, has written that often the masking of one tradition in the disguise of another can be a resistance strategy. But the mingling of multiple traditions can also be a means of affirming otherwise marginalized identities. And that is important to bear in mind when we speak about multiple religious belonging and the experiences of the marginalized. Because the experience and the embrace of the multiple can happen as an act of transgression in response to a logic of singularity and binarism, which often thrives on exclusion and domination. So, multiple religious belonging can also help focus attention on marginalized groups. And it also helps us to understand that fluidity of religious boundaries can be a way in which religious hostilities can be overcome. And this is very true when we look at the concept of contested and shared religious places. Karen Barkley helps us to understand the peace-building potential of shared religious spaces. She points out how the sharing of spaces and traditions by multiple religious communities demonstrate the numerous and varied practices and possibility of accommodation between potentially antagonistic communities. And the study of such sharing provides key insights into the characteristics and features crucial to the cultivation of tolerance and understanding. I want to conclude, and therefore, in conclusion, what I want to say is that in one of our consultations, one of the participants said that while multiple religious belonging may be a relatively new focus for some of us, the existential reality of many faiths, though, is that multiple religious belonging has been happening from the time of any religious Big Bang. And therefore, the challenge for those of us who are interested and committed to interfaith engagement is to take this phenomenon and the experience of its practitioners seriously. In many ways, multiple religious belonging teaches us the value of hospitality, especially in contexts where hostility seems to be the natural and sometimes appropriate response, as understood by its practitioners. Multiple religious belonging also turns our attention to popular religious experience, where ordinary people lead their lives at the borders of shared religious traditions, sometimes in unsettling ways. And it asks interfaith practitioners whether multiple religious belonging can be embraced. To use Michelle Voss Roberts' phrase, they can be embraced not as problems to be solved, but as proliferating sites of divine encounter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peniel. Thank you very much. I would now like to invite Annabelle to share with us her perspective coming from Trinidad and Tobago. Annabelle?
First, let me extend thanks to the UCC, particular to Mark, for inviting me to share with you multiple religious belonging coming from the context of Trinidad and Tobago. As I begin, I would just like to give you an idea, if you do not know where Trinidad and Tobago lies. We are a republic nation, and it's two islands that lie on the continental shelf of South America. Though we lie there, we are not considered part of South America. These two islands compose or is part of what we would regularly call a chain of islands in the Caribbean Sea known as the West Indies. Trinidad is a very small island, 1,864 square miles, and the population is 1.3 million. Tobago has a population of 52,000. The capital of Trinidad is Port of Spain. Capital of Tobago is Scarborough. That's where I live, and that's where I minister, and that is the context from which I am speaking. Next slide. Next. Okay, in order to understand our religious multiplicity, we need to understand the ethnicity of our people. And in Trinidad, as you would see from the nice photograph, the young man who prepared my slides, he gave us a brief look of all the groups of people we would very well find here. And this group that he has shown on our system is what we would refer to as an East Indian community. And the East Indian community is normally called, in our context, Indo-Trinidadian. Indo-Trinidadian meaning we are from a background of the East Indians who came to Trinidad and Tobago when slavery was abolished. They came as indentured servants to work on the cane estate. Next slide. And this is what the early Indo families would have looked like. East Indian, and the East Indian community in Trinidad is 35.4% of the population. Next slide. Then we have the African community. These are the descendants of the freed slaves, and they are termed Afro-Trinidadians. So Afro-Trinidadians, descendants of the slaves, and Indo-Trinidadians, descendants of those who came as indentured. And the African population is 34.5. Next slide. Then there is a mixture of East Indian and African, and they are called Douglas. That's the terminology for you if you are a mixed race of East Indian and African. And that group is 7.5%. Next slide. Then we have other races, and this makes up 15.3% of our population. Next slide. We have the native Amerindian people, Caribs and Arawaks, that occupied the land before the colonists came. And then we have the next group on the next slides. 1.5 is this group. And then we have the Europeans, the Chinese, and the Syrian Lebanese, 2.6. So immediately you will understand that by makeup, the ethnicity of Trinidad and Tobago is diverse. And with a diverse ethnicity comes our diverse religious groups that make up our population. Next slide. You can go to the next one. Those are just symbols that are being shown. So we go to the Christian groups, beginning with the Roman Catholics. They are 21.6%. We have the Pentecostals, the Evangelical and Full Gospel, 12.02. We have the Anglicans, which are 5.67. We have the Seventh-day Adventists, 4.09. Presbyterians, 2.49. Next slide. The Jehovah's Witnesses, 1.47. Baptists, 1.21%. The Methodists, 0.65%. Moravian, 0.27%. Next slide. Then we have the non-Christian groups that live in Trinidad. And that will be the group composed of the following. Next slide. We have 18.15% belong to Hinduism. 4.94 belong to Islam. The Buddhas and the Baha'is, we do not have a statistical figure from the statistical office. Then we have the Afrocentric religions. Those are religious groups or religion that came here with the African community. Next slide. The African community, and I want you to pay attention to this group. The Afrocentric group is a group called Shouter Baptist or Spiritual Baptist, Orisha, and Shango. What is the culture of this multi-racial country, multi-religious country? Our culture is vast and diverse, as you will see as we go along. In Trinidad, we live side by side with all these various religious groups. According to Michelle Jagasa, I like the quote used, it's an everyday life for us living in the Caribbean. This multi-religious fusion and multiracial fusion of people. Next slide. The unique mix of races, and cultures of Trinidad and Tobago can be traced back to the Africans, Indians, Europeans, Middle East, Chinese. They influence all aspects of our life, including the contribution of the Amerindians, which is part of our culture. Next slide. You can have in Trinidad an Islamic mosque and a Hindu temple and a Christian church, all standing side by side in one area. Worship might be at the same time, and we all coexist and live in this form of worship and religion. Next slide. The diversity of our people reflected in the culture and in religion is seen when we have our 2 days of carnival in Trinidad. That's 2 days before Ash Wednesday, when we forget, everybody forget color, creed, class, and religion. And we are all one at this time, celebrating the festival of Carnival, world famous. Next slide. Diwali is the festival of lights of the Hindu community. We all celebrate together, whether we are Hindus, Islamic, Christian. It's a kaleidoscope of celebration. We wear each other's clothing or style of clothing on that day. We prepare food that is of deep East Indian tradition, and we have music. Strange thing in Trinidad and Tobago, as I shared with Mark, is that I am a Christian, but I have Hindu relatives. And on a day like Diwali, a great festival, you are invited to their home. And we must oblige to go because they are relatives. Likewise, Eid-ul-Fitr, which is the Islamic festival for the year that is observed with grandeur, you will be invited to their homes. And at this point, I will put a little more hilariousness to this presentation. I have come from Hindu background on my mother's side of the family. My maternal family are Hindus. My paternal family, my father's side of the family, are Islamics, who some were converted to Christianity. Thus, I was raised in a Christian home and practiced Christianity. But I still have my relatives who belong to the other religious groups. Next slide, please. Well, this is a little anecdote about our calypso and the times we would meet for festivities and the diversity of our religious culture. And, you know, when we look at our religious culture, we look at our ethnic culture and the fusion, it is like a rainbow. We call ourselves a rainbow country because of the way we are fused together and live together. As our national anthem says, every creed and race find an equal place, and God bless our nation. Is there another slide? Now, in this multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, in order for us to meet at forums as religious leaders, over the years, we have developed by the state's approval the interreligious organization. And that is an organization where religious heads of all the religious groups meet and discuss matters concerning religious aspects, social aspects, political aspects. It is a voice of the religious groups in Trinidad that issues statements on matters being discussed by the state and matters of importance. Years ago, one of the big issues was child marriage, which is now outlawed from our books. There are other matters that this group, who among them is the religious head, so it will be a moderator, your archbishop. They would be the ones serving this special committee, and sometimes we even have protests if there is something that the religious groups feel very strong about within my context. Next slide. We have the Trinidad and Tobago Council for Evangelism. This group is made up of a different group of people. You have the Methodists, the Open Bibles, the Nazarene Church, the Evangelical Association, the Caribbean and the Wesleyan Holiness Church. There are independent churches that join this group and the full gospel. It is what we term in Trinidad the more evangelical churches part of this. However, the Presbyterian Church of Trinidad and Tobago is a member of this group because our early leaders firmly believed in ecumenism, and we are part of this group. Likewise, they deal with social issues, religious issues, and speak out for the people on matters being discussed and dealt with by state. Next slide. Then you have the Christian Council of Churches, and this one composes persons on the IRO, persons on the evangelical group. They all get together in this group, and they do the same thing as the other groups. The one thing about this group that I like, during the Lenten season, we encourage a lot of ecumenical service and worship in each other's churches. And Christmas time, they have on the promenades, both north and south of the island, There are services held, caroling done to meet needs of the community and to also, bring forth the season in the life of the Christian churches. So these three organizations is where we get together and speak about things, issue statements of one heart, one mind, one spirit as the churches within Trinidad and Tobago. Next slide, if there is a last one. This is almost what I've already talked about. So I think that's my piece. I just want to add one thing to it. It is not uncommon to find in Trinidad that in a home, there might be Christians living, Islamic persons living, Hindu persons living, and Buddhist person living, or some of the Afrocentric religion. It's not uncommon to see that. And it's not uncommon to go into a home and see pictures of the various gods and goddesses of Hinduism, or even an altar to their gods and goddesses, their deities. It's not uncommon to see that kind of thing. So in Trinidad, multi-religious aspect is diverse and complicated, and it's the everyday life that we live on. As a minister, I can walk into a home and be, the first thing I see is an altar set up to gods and goddesses of Hinduism, or even to the spiritual Baptist faith, but I have a Presbyterian, a Christian living in that home. On that note, I end. Thank you for your time and listening to me.
And thank you. Thank you for sharing. Really appreciate it. One of the realities is within the United Church of Christ, we have several congregations that share space in various places around the United States that share space with a synagogue or a mosque or others. And from those experiences, what we know is that there are oftentimes situations where, and this is also in areas where there is not a shared space, where we have families where the one parent is of one faith tradition and another parent is of a different faith tradition. And those families at times will choose will choose one particular faith tradition for their child to grow up in, but in often cases, it's a situation where the child is exposed to both faith traditions and participates in both faith traditions. And I'd like to invite Peniel also onto the screen at this point as we kind of talk about so in those situations, congregations, it's a known, right? We know that we have these families in our congregations. I think in a lot of cases, it may be an unknown that we have individuals who are practicing multiple, who are participating in multiple faith traditions at the same time. And I guess the question I have for both of you is, given those realities in our congregations, how best do we, as congregational leaders, as people in those congregations, ensure that we are a place of welcome for that? That we, yeah, I guess that's the question. How do we make sure that we are a place of welcome where we have individuals that we know are in those situations and ways to do that, but also when we're coming across situations where we just don't necessarily know, but we still don't create boundaries and limitations.
I'll let my colleague go first.
Thank you, Mark. I'm usually tempted to look at some of the biblical examples of which illustrate that probably multiple religious belonging is much closer to our faith than we often think of it to be. For example, the story of Moses. Moses was born of Hebrew parents, but who brought him up? He was brought up by an Egyptian princess. And what happens? It doesn't stop there. He goes on and marries the daughter of the priest of Midian. So right at the beginning of the Christian scriptures, we have stories like that. And usually stories offer us the framework. We don't pay attention to these stories usually because we have been taught to think of religions in very singular ways. And therefore, it becomes a hindrance for people who might think otherwise to belong to our churches in the fullness of their spiritual riches. And therefore, I often find solace in helping people understand that this is not something which is quite estranged from the stories of our faith, but we can also find it in scriptures, mainstream scriptures, which are close to us. So that I find to be one way which can be convincing, because people use scriptures to exclude, but the same scriptures can be used to include.
For myself, I would say we don't have to work towards creating an environment, because it is an environment in which we live. I think it is sometimes greater to create an atmosphere for the receiving of different ethnic groups into the church rather than different religious persuasion into our setting as Trinidadians. And I say right now in Tobago, we do not have a church, and we share the Anglican Church for our worship services. And most welcoming, they even join us for our service in Tobago. So we don't have to work on it that hard. And, you know, I could even put a plug there. There are people in my congregations I've worked in. The wife is a Presbyterian. She serves as an elder, and the husband is a Hindu. And he comes to church with her because one day he called, he said, Rev, can you give me a recommendation? I said, sure. He called her. He said, Rev, I is not a Presbyterian. And I said, so what I had to do with anything? You are in church. I see you there all the time with your wife and kids. I said, I will write it for you. I just need some information. Because we live it. Jagasa is right. We live it. So we don't have to work that much towards it. I think breaking down in some cases, in my context, the ethnicity barrier can be a little more difficult than the religious barrier.
Thank you. Thank you. Ellie, we have a few questions in the Q&A if you'd like to take that lead.
Yes, we do. And then I also have a question if we have time. But the first one is there a lot of vegetarianism in Trinidad and Tobago churches?
You mean if people are vegans?
Yes, that might seem to be the question.
Okay. You would find it among the Hindu groups. They would be the ones to be more vegetarian persons rather than in the Christian churches. And I can share, I live in a real strange country. I have cousins who are vegetarians, they live in London and they came to Trinidad and I invited them home and I had to figure out how to cook vegetarian because my husband is a carnivore. So we don't really have that problem in that there are people, but it's greater in Hinduism than in the Christian church and Afrocentric religions.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you for that question. We have another question here from a university chaplain in Virginia. They say that, Annabelle, your slides are beautiful. I love the ideas of hybridity as intrinsic to religious faith and fluidity of spirituality because people contain multitudes and are interconnected. I have two questions for either speaker. What is the difference between the terms MRB and interfaith, if any? For instance, interfaith families. And how do we include secular philosophies in MRB?
Can I take it, Annabelle, or do you want to tackle that? For me, MRB is something that an individual embraces. I can be somebody who lives out or whose spirituality is deepened and nourished by more than one faith tradition, whereas interfaith is me as a Christian relating to somebody else or being married to somebody who is from a different faith. So the idea of interfaith families is this is a Christian married to a Hindu, whereas multiple religion is this is a person who identifies both as a Christian and a Buddhist or Christian and Hindu. So that's the main difference for me.
I agree with you on MRB. It is a person's and individual choice that is made. Interfaith, adding to what you're saying, is where the different faiths could meet mutual grounds and be able to work together as to take our people of the various religious persuasion forward, where we can mix, where we can stand together, speak about the issue, be of one mind and spirit. That is more the interfaith mix.
Yes, and I have one last question before I turn it over to Mark. With our multi-religious understanding, our interfaith practices that you find in your personal experiences, where does the beauty lie and the hope lie in us moving forward in the times that we find ourselves? I say that because I know one of the great things about the United States is that we identified as that pluralistic nation where we welcomed and celebrated all expressions of faith. And now that we've gotten that, we do have some consternation. But where is the beauty and the hope that you see for us moving forward?
The hope I see for you in the North American context is where you can grow like us in a sense of accepting each other's religion, understanding each other's practices, and learning to be who we are, but able to embrace what others have to offer, and they too ready to embrace what we have to offer. I would like to see you all there.
Ellie, for me, it is in the embrace and embodiment of hospitality, where we are not only the ones who are setting the table as the host, but also become the guests at the tables of the other. and thereby overcome what one of my Korean friends who also identifies as a Christian Confucian calls, where we overcome the sin of hostility, HOST-ILITY, which is the temptation to play host always. So how do we learn to be not just hosts, but also to be guests at each other's table and embrace and embody that hospitality that comes from learning to be guests?
I love that. That gave me goosebumps. Thank you. Mark, go ahead. You were going to say something.
Yeah, I think I would answer this question in a way. I mean, and it's kind of both last week's webinar and this week's. We speak of this expansive welcome, the extravagant welcome, and we're living in a time of increased divisiveness in the United States. We are seeing people over what, difference of perspective, difference of culture, difference of language, difference of socioeconomic status, dividing ourselves and really leaning frighteningly into an us versus them mentality on so many levels, where we push away that which is different than we are, and to the point of condemning it. And I feel like the idea of in our congregations embracing the concept of multiple religious belonging, like we talked about last week with Purple Churches, is countercultural right now, and providing a model for something different, and really is missional in our time, because it is something we can do for our culture that our culture desperately needs. And so I feel like that's a big piece of this as well.
Yes, I love that very much. I want to thank our presenters today. I want to thank Mark for bringing these amazing humans to share in this very informational webinar series, not only this week, but last week as well. I just want to thank each and every one of you for joining us. And please do, when you get your follow-up email, there will be a link to the Nurture the Soul webinar series on YouTube. Please share with somebody that you think can be moved by what you have heard today. And so what a gift all of you have been in this world, caring for all of God's people, and however, and all of the many names that we call the Creator. Beloveds, we look forward to being with you again next week on Tuesday, October 1st at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for another special offering leading up to this year's election. And this webinar is brought to us by Join the Movement and us here at Nurture the Soul. Almost every ballot measure and candidate policy platform has implications for racial justice, because racial disparities continue to be woven into every part of our political system and common lives. And no matter where your political views are, this election, we're going to be making choices that either maintain that status quo of racism, or we can move towards greater equity and justice. In the United Church of Christ, we have the resources for our faith and the covenants that we share with our General Synod resolutions to help guide us. But with all of that information swirling around us, it can be hard to discern who and what and how to go about building a more just world for all of God's people. So we hope that you'll join us for this webinar on Tuesday, where the presenters will prayerfully engage in careful conversation to discover the ways in which our commitments to intersectional justice and collective liberation can guide our voting and campaigning in this vital moment for democracy in the United States. I want to turn it back over to Mark to give us a benediction and to send us out. And again, so much gratitude to each of you for being here with us today.
And I will share a benediction that I shared last week, that I share in most spaces where I am. And it goes as this: love the people, love the earth, love the universe, and do nothing that violates the God in you, or the unity that exists, though it may remain unseen. Amen.
Siblings in Christ, if you are moved by this conversation, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or has nurtured your soul for the journey, please consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help to provide programs like this, which are an essential part of our ministries in the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed on your journey and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.